Hello again. Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate folks that have been able to tune into these lectures, to my students and those that support us. We are going to offer a historical lecture today entitled We Can't Breathe, A History of Violence Against African Americans, 1619 to 2020. We Can't Breathe. We Can't Breathe is a mantra that I saw a few times that really saddened me and gave me pause for concern because it is reminiscent of the Eric Garner slaying when he was choked in New York some years ago. And here we are again. We see that George Floyd was asphyxiated. I'm not even saying it right. He was choked to death. The coroner's office um, declared that it was asphyxiation. He was choked to death. And so we're here in our own way to protest the death of George Floyd. We thought we would use the tools that we have. I've been trained as a historian, and so I thought that it would be proper to put these slayings and the violence within historical context. A lot of times Americans have difficulty trying to see a historical trend that this is not an isolated incident. It wasn't one bad cop, but it is a racist system that is at play. And racism is not always intentional. It is an institution that has the way it's structured, it disadvantages one group and advantages another group. And so we want to put the George Floyd slaying and others within historical context. Now you see the date 1619. Now 1619 is the date that historians like to use to begin conversations about African American history. Or that is, the first slave came to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, about 15 or 16 indentured servants. They weren't even slaves in the sense of how we would know them by the late 1600s and the early 1700s. Slavery will be racialized, but early on, they came along with white indentured servants, and they were debtors. They had to work off their debt, but pretty quickly, slavery in the United States became racialized. Even at that time in 1619, it was not the United States; it was colonial America, and Virginia was a part of Great Britain. Now we do know. Let me add this: we do know that the first African Americans the first people of African descent came to the Americas long before 1619. And in fact, they came to North America probably a full century earlier in the 1500s. They came to what today is modern Florida, but back then it was Spanish Florida. And so you had African slaves that came to Spanish Florida early on. And even parts of Louisiana used to be France. You had slaves there even before 1600s. But we're going to put this in historical context. We're going to start from the beginning. We certainly can't cover it all, but I wanted to offer some awareness and just do my part just to give us an understanding of what's going on. So hopefully you don't tune me out. Just bear with us. Thank you so much. So I gave you the date 1619, 1865. The legacy of slavery in the U.S. justified the use of violence. So with the legacy of slavery, uh, violence was justified, is what I'm trying to say here. Violence, rape, and murder were justified in the minds of antebellum white society. You see a couple things going on here. Antebellum means before the Civil War, okay? So the mindset was, it was justifiable that one could violently abuse black folks, black bodies, rape, and murder them. That mindset continued well beyond slavery during the Reconstruction period, which is right after the Civil War. During the Nadir period, the black period that was towards the period of sort of black excellence, that was during Reconstruction into the 20th century. That same violent uh, um, legacy of violence towards African Americans all the way to the present. The violence was often perpetrated against black males as they were often thought to be deviant and criminal. And so there was this sense of justification that it was okay to hurt black males because they deserved it. Now you also notice we talked about 1619. That's the date that was used to talk about the beginning of slavery. 1865 is the end of the Civil War. That's why you see this date here, the end of the Civil War. So one of the things that I think many people do not know about, so as I try to give these lectures, I try to offer information that maybe can be new and helpful. So think about this. During the time of slavery, primarily we would say that from the late 1600s to the end of slavery, you had what's called slave patrollers on plantations, particularly the larger plantations, but even in the city. Another fact that's not often talked about is slaves were in the North. New York was once had legalized slavery. Northern Pennsylvania once had legalized slavery. Massachusetts, but by the early 1800s, it was abolished. But in those towns, even in places like New York, where you had urban slavery, you still had individual citizens that they volunteered, they were compelled to volunteer to act as a sort of early police department. Their sole responsibility was to, quote unquote, police blacks, both free and enslaved. Their express aim was to restrict the movement of black folk. So we're talking about a history of violence against African Americans. And so these individuals were compelled, just much like jury duty, where you don't have a choice. If they pick you, you got to go. That's how it was in those days with slave patrollers. They compelled white male citizens to patrol the movement of blacks. And also, let me add this. If we're talking about the South, you had a lot of free blacks in the South. Most people don't realize that all blacks in the South were not slaves. So how were they free, Dr. Childs? Well, I tell you what, there were a couple of different ways you could be a free black. A, your slave master, upon death, could write it in his will that you would be free upon his or her death, he and his wife's death. B, some benevolent slave masters allow slaves to purchase their freedom. So sometimes they would not let you, but there were some masters that let slaves earn enough money through various errands around the town to purchase their freedom. Or C, your relatives could buy your freedom. So if my wife was a slave, I could raise enough money, and it took forever. I could purchase my wife freedom. And here's the thing, you had to have your freedom papers. And so that was a big deal, your freedom papers. You may have heard that term before, but freedom papers were a legal document that outlined your freedom, not the African Americans' freedom. And if you lost it, you had no way of verifying that you were free. Often they would try to destroy freed people's freedom papers, but it was hidden very well. And so if I was walking down the street and came across a slave patroller, they could ask me for my freedom papers, and if I couldn't find them, they would assume I was a slave. Now notice in this image, you see the cowardly looking African American man. Often cartoons portray black folks as looking very cowardly and beggarly and imbecilic. And you see the white males looking dapper and together. This is a racist cartoon, and they often depicted that. Much of racism was depicted in the media and in popular culture. Another thing I wanted to add here is these were our actual badges. I wanted to include some primary source documents so I could show you how deeply embedded the slave patrol system was, especially in the South. This is from 1859. The one on the left is from 1859. The one on the right, if you look closely, you can see it's from 1858. They are slave patrol badges, one from North Carolina, one from South Carolina. Slave patrollers restricted the movement of black folks. As I said earlier, they acted as, they're the predecessor of police departments today. They set the precedent for police departments today. Now, let me offer a little historical analysis. The notion of policing is not unique to America. The notion of policing goes back to even ancient Rome. They had a type of constable, somebody that sort of regulated and enforced the law. But in terms of how policing is done today and the brutality we see, that comes from the slave patrollers. In fact, especially how they set the precedent on how black folks are treated. Now, let me say, as I talk about police brutality, I don't want you to assume that I'm against police officers. In fact, I was just a part of a Zoom committee today where some of the African American male administrators and professors at the university where I teach, we all got together and formed the group. And one of the individuals is a black police officer. And guess what he said? He told me that he sometimes is afraid to walk down the street himself in plain clothes because he doesn't know what's going to happen. And I have many police officer friends. So I don't want you to dismiss this lecture and say Dr. Child is against police officers, because I'm not. I mean, often that's a distraction by people because they don't want the truth. So don't get into blue lives matter and these kinds of things. But slave patrollers were early form of police department. Let's say more. We're going to keep slave patrollers, look at this. We're at liberty to use deadly force if necessary, including guns and other physical weapons in order to apprehend a black person. Now, this is a newspaper. I talked about primary source documents. If you're not used to historical research, sort of the bread and butter for historians is primary source documents. A primary source document are documentation that is from the time period, but it's not necessarily regulated to paper documents. Primary sources could be a song, an original video from like the 1950s. Primary sources can be a piece of artwork. It can be the slave patrol buttons that I showed you earlier. They're artifacts. And this is a particularly beautiful specimen of artifact. This is from 1836. If you look at the date there, January 1836, volume 2, number 1. This is a publication called the Anti-Slavery Record, a fact with a short commentary. Now, I wanted to show you the image. This is a slave patroller that has caught a runaway, and they were at liberty to use guns, physical weapons. They killed black folks without regard, because let's remember, their body was very cheap. Black bodies were cheap and thought of as animals. If you read a lot of the manifest of the material that a lot of wealthy aristocratic slave owners had, if you read it, you can find this stuff. This is how I've done my research. They list their items: 12 horses, 20 pigs, 60 bags of sugar, 20 Negroes, and they have the price right next to them, okay? Their inventory, that's the word I was trying to think of. And so it was nothing to kill them. On the very large plantations, the slave master was a judge, jury, and executioner. And often they did kill slaves, whether it was whipping them or maiming them, they died and they didn't get due process. Because it was also against the law in many southern states for a black man to testify against a white man. And so the slave controlling system in the South set the historical precedent of how many police officers treat African Americans in contemporary times. Okay, so let me pause here and say, Americans often, we are ahistorical. We don't look at things in historical context. We don't understand the value of history. And then when we do read history, we read a very Eurocentric history, and it omits women's history. It omits Native American history. It omits African American history, and it only deals with white history, the founding fathers, as the most important history. And when in fact, everything happened all together. Native American history didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened right alongside white history and black history. They all happen together. So in order to get accurate history, you have to understand this. African American history is American history. Native American history is American history. Irish American history, German American, so forth and so on. In fact, Irish used to be considered a race. But then by the 20th century, it became black and white. Okay? Um, so I'm doing this to help us understand that George Floyd is an ugly part of our history. In the same way, American history was all about the Civil War, Revolutionary War was a part of our history, the Patriots, Native Americans, the Wild West in the late 1800s, the War of 1812 was a part of American history, the stock market crash, Vietnam War. You know, we could go on and on because I love American history. Jazz was a part of our history. The romantic artists, the impressionists, the realist artists, the abstract expressionism by the artists of the 20th century, Art Deco, all these art movements was a part of our history, but also violence against blacks and particularly black males in his highest form was also a part of African American history. And so to see a string of police shootings is all too familiar. Okay, I'm going to talk about lynching here pretty soon. Neighborhood watch patrolling blacks. In the same way, the patrollers set the precedent for attitudes of many whites towards black folk today. In many scenarios, white folk, even many in the church, feel the need to monitor, report on, and apprehend black people. They feel they are getting out of line in the name of keeping the community safe. And you see these signs like this. Neighborhood watch. The idea of patrolling their movements. It goes back to slave times of what we're saying. When I'm walking down the street, often people will question me. My wife and I, we go walking a lot. We like to go walking, and when we walk a couple blocks over, we can see just as clearly when people are not comfortable with our bodies being in that space, and they will come and ask us what we're doing and things like that, or try to act polite about it, but they're monitoring our movement. Often I've been pulled over by police officers when I get lost in the neighborhood. I'll get pulled over. I've been told point blank I look like I'm in the wrong neighborhood. I've been told that by police officers. And so it's this idea of whites feeling, some whites, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but in my experience, many whites feel the need to monitor and patrol people of color because the thought is they'll get out of hand. You might say, well, black on black crime. What about black on black crime? What about all the crime we see black people doing? That's why I'm afraid. Well, to be honest, the media sensationalizes black crime. It's not as much as you would think. Trust me, I grew up in the inner city. I spent some time in the inner city. And often our neighborhood was very, very quiet. I'd take walks in the neighborhood by myself. Nobody ever mugged me. Nobody ever robbed me. But it's sensationalized. And so, in fact, black on black crime is not really a thing. That's a term invented by the media to scare people and to hype people up. You say, well, black people are killing each other. Why are we protesting the death of George Floyd by police? Why are we focused on white police officers? What about all the black people that's killing each other? Well, that's a distraction too. That's a diversionary tactic. In fact, nobody ever uses the term white on white crime because it's not a thing. They want to focus on blacks. In fact, let me add this. Most of the crime that are perpetrated against white folks are by other white people. Statistically, by far, most of the crime that's done towards white people are by other white people. But nobody ever says white on white crime. In fact, let me add this one too. Most of the drug dealers statistically are white people. But who gets the stigma of being a drug dealer? Black people. You can look these statistics up yourself. But anyway, neighborhood watch is they say, well, we're just looking for criminals. I don't see color. Yes, you do. when you see a black person walking down the street, you most likely will stop them if you have that mindset that they're a thug. Okay. All right, I can give multiple examples. In many ways, Neighborhood Watch patrolling blacks. And Jackson Pollock, that's the person I was thinking of. Abstract expressionism is a historical time period. Jackson Pollock is the artist I was thinking of when I was going through a historical analysis. But in the same way that abstract expressionism was part of history, violence against black folks is a part of history. In many ways, in many rural communities in both the North and the South, and in predominantly white neighborhoods throughout the U.S., neighborhood watch committees have been developed with the same spirit of keeping the neighborhood safe from thugs and criminals who they usually envision as people of color. Now, I want you to be honest about this. When we think of a person of color, when we think of a thug and a criminal, the image that pops up in our heads is a black person, or usually a black person, a person of color. You might be in denial about that, but that's what we have come to believe. You might rationalize it, but a lot of people out there, that's how you envision it. That's how folks are getting killed. They see them as incorrigibles that need to be gotten rid of. These same individuals will claim they do not see color, but when they see a black person walking down the street, jogging, driving in the neighborhood pool, getting their mail in the apartment building, on their campus, or any space they deem a white space, they feel the need to patrol them or report quote-unquote suspicious behavior. Evangelicals even monitor the type of black folks that are acceptable in their churches or bar them from leadership positions such as pastoral or key influential teaching roles. And I pointed that out. I'm an ordained minister myself. I pointed that out that when often in the church setting, when people are promoted, they don't promote. Often they don't promote people of color. They'll put people of color in the music department and the arts department, but in terms of leadership, if you look at it statistically around the nation, a lot of people are uncomfortable with black leadership. So let me put it like this: when you go to a lot of churches today, you will see people of color and black folks. They're very comfortable sitting under white leadership. But what's rare, I don't want to say it doesn't exist, but what's more rare is a black pastor in charge of, let's say, a mega church, or a church with 300 people, 300 white people sitting under them. People are uncomfortable with that, and that's the legacy of racism in this country. Okay, let's get into lynching. The reason I want to talk about lynching is this is very, very important. The definition of lynching in terms of the social historical, a lot of scholars don't just define lynching as hanging, but lynching in the African American context can mean any kind of violence used to kill African Americans. Let me add this too. Let's talk about the word terrorism. That's a loaded political term. Who we call terrorists is political. Often, when we think about terrorism, we think about a person from another country, even more specifically, a person from the Middle East. But the biggest terrorists in the United States have been white supremacist group, in particularly the Ku Klux Klan. They have what the definition of terrorism is using violence to bring about political gain, using violence, murder, and mayhem to achieve a political aim or political agenda. And there has been no bigger group to do that in any larger percentage than the KKK and other white supremacist group, because they use violence to systematically scare African Americans from voting and being involved in the political process. But when I say lynching, when many of us scholars say lynching, we mean shootings, we mean burnings, we mean stabbings and hanging, all of the tactics used to kill African Americans for political reasons, and also just to kill them because they didn't see their bodies as redeemable, as being valued. So lynchings in the late 19th century to early 20th century. Let's talk a little bit about that. The late 1800s to the early 20th century. The justification of the killing of black males have been a part of the American psyche. So this is a chilling picture, especially for me as a black male. Often, who do they hang? Folks like myself, professors, business people, pastors, people that spoke out against the political white establishment, individuals that talk too much, people that dated white girls, everything that they felt that challenged the white supremacist structure, you were threatened to be hung. There's a book I would like you to check out called Hand on a Freedom Plow. And that book has to do with the lynchings that happened in those small town America, like Louisiana, Mississippi, all these lynchings that often went unreported, but it was used as a tactic to keep black folks as second-class citizens. But these were often put on postcards. Look at the people pointing. They're so proud of it. I also have some images where there are children in the audience. So this is, they're very close up too. This is scary to me. And notice they're black males because people were threatened by black males. They saw us as brutes. Scientific racism said that black males, a type of pseudoscience from the mid to late 1800s that took place in university. It was bogus research, false research based on flawed data that said African Americans were closer to apes in their evolution and people of European descent were higher up on the evolutionary chain. It was a way to twist science to convince people that black people were closer to animals, so therefore it was easier to destroy and harm their bodies. But they were very proud of their domestic terrorism. This is terrorism outright. Um, to my white brothers and sisters that are listening, just imagine if you were systematically hung or your ancestors were systematically hung and shot even in the streets today. Wouldn't this be frightening to you? You think this is scary just by looking at it? Try being a person of color. And so I want you to consider that that you may not understand it, but don't just outright dismiss it because you do not understand it. So I really want to get that point over that you not challenge it and make excuses. Okay, let's move forward. Burnings were a part of lynching. You see the smoke. This is a charred body. This is a charred. I don't enjoy showing this, but I just want you to get the point. Lynching was more than just hanging, and so you can probably see where I'm going. Lynching was harm and murder done to the black body to exert power over them, and this is a part of that history. In 1920, this is a postcard depicting the lynching of Leach Daniels. All of the photos I showed you before, I should say, of lynching were from the 20th century. Some say as many as 5,000 hangings, 5,000 lynchings took place from the late 1800s to the mid 20th century, the mid to late 20th century. But furthermore, more than that, if we're including all of the police slayings, and that's where I'm going with this. 1920, Leach Daniels in Center, Texas, a postcard depicting the lynching of Leach Daniels. This is a postcard that people send to each other. August 3rd, 1920. The back reads, this was made in the courtyard in Center, Texas. Look at the children involved in that. Can you imagine that? It's like the days of the gladiators when they watched people being persecuted, Christians being persecuted by lions and torn apart and people fighting each other to the death. It's the same primal spirit that you see here. And I've read where the school children were allowed to go to school late or take a break from school and go to the public hanging in the South and then come back and then get back to their studies a little bit later. So just troubling. All right. 1946, Morris Ford, Georgia. Again, this is scary to me. That looks like the body of a woman. Much of the violence against black women as well, but a clear pattern of violence against black men has been the norm since colonial times in the U.S. Women were killed too, but by and large, people are intimidated by black males, particularly large black males. People see them as savage. And even today, officers often see us as a threat. The mantra you'll hear over and over again is, they'll say, "Why did you kill him?" "I felt threatened." Even when the officer has no gun, the assailant has no gun, and he's not resisting arrest. Just the presence of him being black, an African American, is a threat. And part of this comes from history, a whole history of people portraying African American males, black people, as some type of threat and deviant. Even the old cartoons and even the old pictures showing the menacing African American. This is in the American psyche today. So we're getting to the more to the 20th century. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing killed 4 little girls while they were in Sunday school. This was you see a newspaper here that portrays that. Another primary source here. We talked earlier about primary sources. That is original documents that portrayed, that you can use to interpret history. Hate triggered church blast kills 4 little girls. King asked for federal intervention. The other one says FBI sent in guard, put on alert. Mayor asked troops. And so this was 1963. The 16th Street Baptist Church is in Birmingham, Alabama. African Americans, that is frequently, it was frequented, it is still in operation today, frequented predominantly by African Americans. In 1963, the church was the target of white supremacist terrorism when it was bombed by the KKK. The bombing killed 4 young girls in the midst of the civil rights movement. The church is still in operation today, and it's the Birmingham Civil Rights District. It was designated National Historical Landmark. And so can you imagine that the little girls that got killed, and they were a part of that violence. Now, what I want to say is that violence by authorities is also a part of American history. Remember when we talked about the fact that various things we have come to know that represent American history? Well, another part of American history we've been talking about is violence by authority figures. Not just police, but by authority figures has been a staple of American history. The 4 girls that were bombed in that church, they fit right along with the history we've been seeing unfold before us. Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, we're going to get into that later. But these 4 girls, Addie Mae Collins was 14 years old. Cynthia Wesley was 14. Carol Robertson was 14. And Carol Denise McNair was 11 years old. They were serving the Lord. They were studying the Bible. They were praying in Sunday school, and hate reared its ugly head. 1963. Lots of folks will say, "Well, Dr. Childs, why are you bringing this up? My ancestors were slaves. It wasn't me that was a slave." Slavery was over a long time ago. You said it ended in 1865. Why are we still talking about racism? After all, we had a black president. Well, it didn't just cut off. If you understand history, racism and hate and discrimination didn't just stop after the 60s. It kept going. In fact, it's much worse in many ways. The police shootings. I've been pulled over by police officers and I had to remain calm. I've been pulled over as a professor on campus and coming back from graduate school, had my car searched for drugs. Just because some people, when they read me, they read criminal, they read drug dealer. My whole life has, and I'm not going to go into too many stories, but my whole life has been one of experiencing racial prejudice. It's been a few months now in terms of overt, because I've been in the house because of COVID-19 and quarantine. But for example, I was recently driving down the street with a pastor friend of mine. We were going to look at a used car, and we were pulled over by the police. And we weren't speeding. We didn't have anything wrong with our license plate, and he didn't even cite a violation. He said that there are some known drug dealers in that area, and he was pulling us over. He saw two black males. He was pulling us over to see where we drug dealers. So that's racial profiling. That's a lived experience for me. So one of the things people will try to do is tell me how I should feel and tell me that I'm wrong about my own experience. This is the time to listen. I want to make an appeal to my white brothers and sisters. This is the time to listen. Nobody here to judge you, but people are here to call out racism, okay? That's why I like to talk about this history. This is 1963. See, it's easy to dismiss it when it's in the past, but let's keep going. I want to jump back and talk about the Ku Klux Klan. They're American terrorists. Violence against black males from the Ku Klux Klan has been a staple throughout U.S. history. The KKK has long been a symbol of terror and terrorism in the African American community as well. Some people make the argument racism is racism. Why are you guys singling out black racism? People have told me I experienced racism as a white person. Okay, maybe you have. But African Americans have been uniquely persecuted in the United States. They have been uniquely, systematically killed. White people were never enslaved in the United States. Folks will say, oh, Dr. Childs, white people were slaves in Europe, etc. and so forth. First of all, you are dismissing the racism that is in front of our face. Black folks were enslaved. White people were never systematically enslaved in the United States. They were never lynched systematically because of the color of their skin. Their wives were never raped systematically by the hands of white slave owners and other white supremacists. So this history carries on to today. And I'm going to say this a little bit later, but I'll say it now. Black people die at a much higher rate by the hands of law enforcement than whites. You notice I'm using data. I'm not giving my opinion. Too many people are on Facebook and social media giving their opinion and not enough people listening and learning. But KKK have been a staple. Let me give you a little bit of historical context. Now, the Klan came about in the 1860s. They were disgruntled Confederate soldiers, disgruntled, angry Confederate soldiers. They were upset that the South had lost the war. You know that when the rebels first rose, they thought they were much tougher than the North. They used to think that they could beat a Yankee, two Yankees with their hands tied behind their back. And it took three Yankees to beat one Southerner because they were so tough. So when they actually lost the war to the Union, they were flabbergasted. And so those ex-soldiers, they took up arms, and that's how the KKK came about. They knew that slavery was no longer legal. So let me give you a little bit of historical context with that. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, they passed the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment made slavery illegal with the exception of incarceration. you are legally a slave when you are incarcerated. And most of the African Americans, most people that are incarcerated in this country are black, and they're on chumped up charges, things they didn't. A lot of them are put in there for things they didn't do, but they pleaded out. But the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave black people citizenship. The 15th Amendment gave African American males the vote. Women didn't vote till the 1920s. So after slavery was made illegal, the Southerners were resentful, and so the Klan rose up to restrict the freedom of black folks. This is chilling too. You heard me talk about religion a little bit earlier. A lot of the churches in the South aligned with the Klan. What you have to understand, the KKK was a very prestigious group in the South. They were much like, they were a fraternal order like the Masons or like the Odd Fellows. And they promised pastors high-ranking positions in the Klan if they actually joined. And so it was really quite evil to blend religion and spirituality with white supremacy. And much of the churches in our country today have a white supremacist tinge. They have intertwined white supremacy with Christianity. That's an inflammatory statement, but I want to offer a caveat for that. White supremacy masquerading as Christianity. So you have two ways of looking at white supremacy. There is the extremist version, which you see here, but also there's the white supremacy by definition, meaning things that European Americans do, that white folks do, it's better. For example, the way that white people speak is better than black people. Not necessarily. Black folks can communicate. That's the way they choose to speak. The way they carry on business, the way they do church, is thought of as better or best. That's just white supremacist thinking. And you are downplaying someone else's culture. Okay. Another image of the Klan in church, Jesus saves. That's chilling to mix, knowing what the Klan does, systematically killing folks. Let me add this piece too. In terms of modern day lynching and connected to the past, a lot of or some, I don't know the percentage, but I do have seen evidence. Some of the police officers were members of the Klan. Even today, police officers are tied to white supremacists, the alt-right. Police officers are card-carrying members of the Klan. There's an article that you can Google it. They found a police officer with a Klansman application framed on his wall. And so make no mistake, some law enforcement folks are involved with white supremacist groups, some political figures, city council people. That's why this is so insidious. But here we have, once again, the Klansmen connected to religion. Many churches in the U.S. equate Christianity with white supremacy. That is, white and European culture are the best. That's what they think. They advocate violence against people of color and political opponents. Although the picture below is from the 1920s, the spirit of this hate is among us today via politics and the alt-right. Law enforcement that are members of the Klan, pastors that are advocating civil war if the election does not go their way. And this is what people have been talking about, that they will riot and cause civil war if the election doesn't go their way this year, if for the 2020 election. Let's move forward here. We're still talking about the history of violence against black males. By 1969, you have the rise of the Black Panthers. I want to offer another misconception, challenge another misconception. People equate Black Panthers with the KKK. That's historically inaccurate. It's unequivocally inaccurate. The Panthers never systematically killed white people. The Panthers do not have the blood of thousands of people on their hands like the KKK. In fact, the Panthers never killed anybody. If the leaders of Black Panther leaders Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were slain in a police raid, They were a threat to the establishment. They were intelligent black men with guns, and that makes people uncomfortable. But it's a mythology to compare the Black Panthers to the KKK. That is an unlearned statement. That's a ignorance. The Panthers were a group that primarily believed in protecting the black community. There was a lot of killings and slayings by the Klan, and so black folks took up arms to protect their own people. In fact, the Black Panthers ideologically would align with the NRA today. They believed in their Second Amendment right, and they exercised it. But that made people uncomfortable to see black folks with guns walking around. In fact, look at the protests. Look at the COVID-19 protests, and look at what's going on with a lot of the white supremacists. They are carrying guns. They're white men carrying guns. Nobody's shooting them. People are respecting them with their guns. But when black people carry guns legally, it's a threat, and they can be shot. So also the Panthers were they had lunch programs, all kinds of things for the community. From 1972 to 1991, the John Berg police torture scandal. You can do a little research on that. There was some systematic torture of black folks by police in that whole time period. Almost 10-year period. Or 20-year period, I'm sorry. So we get closer to today. In New Orleans, a crew of white detectives responded to the killing of a white police officer in 1980 by terrorizing the black community of Algiers, killing 4 innocent people and torturing numerous others. 2005, the NOPD officer fatally shot an unarmed black man named Henry Glover. Then several of his fellow officers burned his body to cover up their crime. Talking about the history of violence against black males, particularly in this country. 1997, New York, a NYPD officer sexually assaulted a Haitian American man named Abner Loimi in a precinct station bathroom by shoving a broken broomstick up his rectum. Violence against black males. 1999, 4 officers from the NYPD's street crimes unit fired 4 shots at Amadou Diallo, a Guinea immigrant who was reaching for his wallet. They hit him 19 times. He was just reaching for his wallet. This history. This is nothing new that's going on today, but it's got to stop. Among the most notorious cases was the brutal 1991 beating of Rodney King by 5 LAPD officers. A video captured most of the brutality. Also showed several officers standing by and doing nothing to stop the pummeling of a defensive black man. This is one of the early videos before we had cell phones that televised police brutality, and it really sparked this whole movement of defensive, going on the offensive by trying to film, going on defense by trying to get things on camera, get brutality on camera, police brutality on camera. The past, not this past August 2014, LAPD officers fatally shot an unarmed, mentally ill African-American man named Ezell Ford, who witness said was shot in the back while lying on the ground. The 1990s in Oakland, California, so we're in Oakland now, in the late 1990s, a unit of police officers dubbed the Rough Riders systematically beat, framed, and planted narcotics on African Americans whom they claimed were dealing drugs. 2009, an officer shot and killed a young black man named Oscar Grant, who was lying face down, unarmed, in a busy transit station. The shooting was videotaped and led to militant protests in Oakland. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's why I'm doing this. 1998, James Berg killing New York City. My years. Milwaukee. From 2007 to 2012 in Milwaukee, a unit of white police officers spurred on by the department's CompStat program of aggressive policing stopped and illegally body cavity search more than 70 African American men whom they claimed to be investigating for drug dealing. And so I'm thankful I didn't live in that city. They would have searched me. Although I was searched. I'll give you a story. This is typical of my upbringing. When I was a teenager, I worked at the mall. I was 17, 18 years old. I worked at the mall in Subway. I was coming home. I was supposed to be home at a certain time. My mom was looking for me, and I was detained by the police in the parking lot with my Subway uniform on. And they took me into the security office and began to question me. And I was told that a white woman reported that I was breaking into somebody's car. And after talking to them for a really long time with no representation, they did not call my parents, my mother at all. They found out that it was a case of mistaken identity. I fit the description. They saw a young black man in the parking lot, and somebody told on me. I was actually going to my own car. That's an example of the trauma that black males experience. Right now, it's a week, as I said, after the George Floyd incident where he was murdered. Times are scary. I don't really go outside much, and I've had to talk with my son, my teenage son, about being careful. Trayvon Martin, and this is the high-profile case. This is sad to even look at. Look at this kid. He's just a kid, just a kid. But everyone apparently doesn't see these guys as just a kid. They see him as a threat. They see him as a monster who needs to be slain and killed. His dates were February 5th, 1995 to 2012. This is so sad to even do this. Was 17-year-old African American from Miami Gardens, Florida, who was fatally shot by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer. Remember we talked about the patrols, people to patrol black bodies, people to patrol and watch the movement of black males in particular. Martin had gone with his father on a visit to the father's fiance at her home townhouse at the retreat at Twin Lakes in Sanford. That's so sad. There, Eric Garner. This is the gentleman that was choked to death. This is where the mantra "I can't breathe" came from, and we see it again. We see an unfortunate repeat of history. Garner was in 2014 in New York. The footage was filmed by a bystander. Shows Eric Garner being wrestled to the ground in a chokehold by NYPD officer before turning limp. The father, 43, can be heard gasping, "I can't breathe." He was later pronounced dead at the hospital. Protests erupted in New York after a grand jury failed to indict the officer responsible. Many people are afraid that that's going to happen. Let me say a word about the protest. Just because looting is happening doesn't mean it's black folks. In fact, there's a lot of footage out there that shows that it's white people doing the looting and stealing. But the image that's conjured up in people's mental model, when they think about stealing and folk that are opportunists, they think about people that look like me. But a bad person is a bad person, okay? So keep that in mind. There are radical groups out there from the radical right and from the radical left that are destroying things and being violent. I don't advocate that. But check this out. That doesn't negate our right to peacefully protest. You can't dismiss the whole conversation about racism because people out there goofing off and breaking windows that shouldn't be. The fact still remains George Floyd was choked to death for all to see on camera, and people are still defending the officers. August 24th, Michael Brown killing Ferguson, Missouri, the legacy of racism in Ferguson. There was a whole history of racism that even led up to the point where Mike Brown was killed. Whole history of racism in Ferguson. I know one of my good friends, he talked about that. This was very sad to me because I identify as a Christian myself. In 2015, I'm not going to even say his name, a white supremacist young person came in. They had invited him, a white guy, to the Bible study. He came in with ulterior motives. Now, this was a an assassination. Why do I say that? Some of these folks were high-profile black folks that were prominent. You had Clementa Pinckney. She was 41. She was the church's pastor, and she was a South Carolina senator. You had, not I like to include the pictures. You had Cynthia Marie Graham, the manager of the Charleston County Public Library System. These were prominent people. Susie Jackson was a choir member. She was the oldest victim that was killed. She was 87. Ethel Lee Lance was the church's sexton. That's the building keeper, the building manager. That's a religious term, sexton. DePayne Middleton was a doctor, 49. I'm sorry, Middleton Doctor was the last name. A pastor, administrator, admissions coordinator at, he was a university worker, Southern Wesleyan University. Grandnephew victim was Susie Jackson. He was the youngest victim. Tawanza Sanders. Then there was Daniel Simmons, a pastor who also served at Greater Zion AME Church. Sharonda Coleman Singleton, a pastor. She was a speech therapist and worked at the local high school as a track coach. And then there was the Bible teacher, Myra Thompson. All these folks were massacred in that long tradition of black bodies being slain. And I like to get women in there too, to talk about the women. A lot of times the focus on the males being killed, but women has been killed as well, but it's just the males have been killed at a higher rate. All right. September 2018, Botham Jean was a devout Christian. He was a graduate student, very active in his church. A police officer went into his house in Little Rock, Arkansas. When he was home, he was sitting there eating ice cream, and she killed him in September 2018 by the Dallas police. This is so sad. Look at Tamir Rice. A lot of times you've heard the name, but you haven't seen the face. Look at that. He's a baby, 12 years old. And then Jordan Edwards, very young, 15, both killed by police officers. Ahmaud Arbery, he was the gentleman that was jogging last month, and he was out jogging, and he was murdered by two white men. Again, that patrol, they were out patrolling, they saw a black man running. In their mind, he was doing something he wasn't supposed to do, and he was killed. This idea in the mind of some white folks, racists, that they need to control the movement and the freedom and limit the freedom of black folks and police us. Calling the phone, calling the police when they see us in the apartment complex, which we live in, those kinds of things. And then here we have Brother George Floyd. He was killed last Monday. A white Minneapolis police officer kneeled on Floyd's neck for at least 7 minutes. His attorney says 8 minutes. And this is why a lot of protesting all around the world too. I've never seen anything like this. Protesting all over the world, not just the United States, that saying no justice, no peace. And so we need, something needs to give. This is about reconciliation. This lecture is about putting things in historical context and us all coming together in a meaningful way. Not just coming together to ignore issues, not just come together to ignore problems, but come together in a meaningful way. Many more have been killed by the hands of law enforcement. And you can see the poster here: Freddie Gray, Anthony Hill, Eric Garner, Oscar Grani, Alton Sterling, Tatiana Jefferson, Botham Jean, I talked about that, him, Jordan Edwards, Ahmaud Arbery, Jordan Davis, Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, so many, Orlando Castile, Emmett Till, Sam DuBose in Cincinnati, where I'm from, slain at the hands of law enforcement or authorities or white supremacy. The sixth leading cause of death for young black men is by the hands of law enforcement. I don't know if you know this, but I'm black, and that applies to me. So thankfully, COVID-19, I haven't had to worry about it. But I do have to go to the grocery store sometime, and I've had to talk with my son to just be careful when he's he's not driving yet. He's not even old enough to drive. We were pulled over in front of our driveway, and for nothing, I was allegedly ran a stop sign. But the officer was questioning my son, who at that time was 14, asking him for his ID. And I said, he's a child. He doesn't have an ID. And so that was a scary moment because the officer was he was heightened state of emotion. And I had to settle the officer down. I calmed the officer down. And so we live in a messed up world. I want to end here. I want to talk about Colin Kaepernick just really quickly. The poster here says, "This is why Colin Kaepernick knelt," and I think it's very powerful. I had a conversation. I was reading something where a white person I knew said that they always thought Colin Kaepernick was a thug. They always thought, he was a troublemaker. A lot of people said that. They called him names, called him the N-word. NFL won't let him play, etc. and so forth. But this particular individual, after it happened with George Floyd, he got it. He got it. He said, "I see why Cap is kneeling now." That really touched my heart. So in closing, I want to say I am, as I said earlier, I'm from the Christian tradition. I'm all about unity. I'm all about connecting with my white brothers and sisters and the white allies out there. But we're going to do it the right way. I refuse to do it by ignoring the problem of race. I refuse to do it by bringing up whataboutisms. That is, what about all the violence that's going against white people? What about all the violence that's being perpetrated against police officers? That's disrespectful because George Floyd was the one that was killed. His family is grieving right now. It's disrespectful to bring up other issues. So what you're doing, you're negating the fact that he was murdered. You're disrespecting the fact that he was murdered because it makes you feel uncomfortable. So you want to shift to political talking points from Fox News and other entities that act as dog whistles, and they have radicalized people and made people insensitive and mean-spirited. But in fact, folks, we need to come together right now and figure out how we're going to stop people from getting killed and how we're going to actually bring about real racial reconciliation. I'm all about racial reconciliation. So thank you for tuning in. I'll probably do some more lectures along this line, just using what I have to do my own protesting. Everybody be safe and have a good one. God bless.